Hello everyone, I'm CS Pacat and this is the DVD commentary for Captive Prince Book 2. Before I start the commentary, I should probably let you know that I am terrible at pronouncing the French names in my own book. I had this idea that I could edit in a suave French man saying the name
Laurent.
every time that I needed to say it, but instead you're going to get me saying it. Please don't take my pronunciation as a guide, otherwise you're going to be saying all my names with a really strong Australian accent. Apologies to any French listeners among you as I massacre your language. If you were one of the original readers of the story who was reading when it was an online serial, you'll probably remember that there was about a 5-month gap between chapter 18 and chapter 19 finally being posted. What you may not know is that I spent pretty much that entire time writing, just draft after draft. Does this one work? No, it doesn't. How about this one? No, that's not working either. It's not just that it was challenging technically, I was also really, really nervous. It was absolutely performance anxiety. And just between you guys and me, in the lead up to the sex scene behind the scenes, I was getting a lot of emails from readers, and the emails were pretty much all about the same thing, and that was who was going to be on top during the sex scene. That was somehow the number one thing that everybody cared about. I would say that I got maybe not hundreds, but certainly more than 100 emails from readers threatening to rage quit if their preferred character was not on top. But the funny thing about that was that it was about half and half. About half of the emails were from readers threatening to rage quit if Damon was not on top, and about half of the emails were from readers threatening to rage quit if Laurent was not on top. So I went into the scene knowing that a section of readers had invested in outcomes with a remarkable level of, how can I put this, mechanical specificity, and that no matter what I wrote, I was going to lose a section of my reader base. So I had to try and put all of that to one side and instead focus on what I felt was right for the scene. What I wanted for the chapter was to make it as in character as possible and to make it as intimate as possible. Sometimes when I read sex scenes, they can feel almost performed, as though the characters are performing for me, the reader, acting in ways that are intentionally hot. It's almost voyeuristic, but it feels as though the text knows that the voyeur is there. The watcher is sort of built into the scene, which is not necessarily a bad approach, but it's not one that I wanted for this scene. I wanted this to feel so intimate that it was almost uncomfortable to be reading. Like, you shouldn't be watching this, yet you can't look away. That was my aim over and above anything else. When I've written DVD commentaries in the past, I've tried to limit what I talk about to writing mechanics only. But this chapter was so character-oriented that I am going to have to discuss characterization along the way. I normally try and avoid that because I know that readers can carry quite different versions of characters in their heads. And I like that idea that readers are constructing their own characters. I sort of think the reader's version is precious and that the author should really stay out of it. But this chapter is so character-focused, it's really impossible to talk about the basis for any of my decisions without talking about characterization. So I hope you'll forgive me that, and I hope you'll also forgive me this really long intro. Let's get on with the DVD commentary. When the scene started, I wanted Damon to be angry. I wanted him to be furious, and it was really important to me that none of his anger for what happened in the previous chapter be directed at Laurent, despite the fact that Laurent is responsible for everything that happened in the previous chapter. I was trying to show a key shift in Damon. He's always been a biased narrator, but for the first time in this moment, his bias is towards Laurent. So for the first time, he isn't angry with Laurent. He's protective of Laurent and he's angry with everyone else. What I really wanted to have happen was for Damon to walk out of the tower, walk straight into Aymric's room and just punch Aymric in the face. I thought that would have been amazing. I thought it would have shown just how biased Damon was, that he was laying blame in the completely wrong place, and yet it was sort of the right place as well. But of course, I couldn't do that because Aymric, as you know, commits suicide next chapter, and I couldn't have the last thing that Damon did be punch Aymric in the face. But if Aymric had lived, I totally would have had Damon punch him. I wrote a line later on that Damon wanted to punch Aymric in the face. That was because I wanted Damon to punch Aymric in the face. Truthfully, it's a bit out of character for Damon to leave Laurent alone in the tower. I had to do quite a lot of work to make it as in character as possible. I felt as though Damon was in a protective mode. He knows that something's wrong with Laurent. He knows that Laurent's processing emotions. He would give Laurent privacy because he knows that Laurent needs privacy, but he'd stay right outside the door until Laurent came out. But I had to get him into the bedroom. I was not going to have them having their first time out on the battlements in front of everyone. So I had to find some way to get him off the battlements and into bed. It was one of those classic cases where the needs of the plot conflicted with characterization. When I hit those kinds of moments, what I try and do is find some facet of the character that will allow them to perform the action. So to look for something within their characterization that will let them do what I need them to do for plot reasons. In this case, Damon's duty towards his homeland was the only thing I could think of that was strong enough to combat his feelings towards Laurent at this point in the story. So I had to call on that to get him off of that damn battlement. Sort of like, I can't hang around outside my boyfriend's door. I have to go and take back my kingdom. There's a mood transition here between angry Damon on the battlements and more melancholic Damon in his rooms. Writing emotional transitions is always really difficult for me, especially with Damon, because Damon is a character who is not articulate about his emotions. He's not even really in touch with his emotions. He absolutely doesn't narrate his emotional state to himself. He's never like, I feel sad. So manufacturing an emotional state for him is often about finding something for him to do that expresses his mood, but that doesn't require him to realize consciously what his mood is. So in this case, with the transition from anger to melancholy, I tried to use his encounter with the soldier to show a transition. The bed, I just wanted to give them a stupidly opulent, gorgeous bridal bed. Shut up. So from the moment that Laurent walks into the room, all the way down to the moment where Laurent says he finds it difficult to let go of control, that whole section is a section of the chapter that I referred to in beta as the swathe. The swathe was this vast swathe of text that I couldn't get to work. And as you can see, it comprises most of the sex scene. Friends would ask me, how's the swathe? And I would just make these inarticulate noises because the swathe was never working. I wrote so many drafts of the swathe. I used so many different approaches and dynamics when I was writing the swathe. There were so many things that seemed logical at the time, and then when I tried them on the page, they just didn't work at all. One of the biggest false starts that I had was this. Because their relationship up to this point had been about Laurent growing gradually more trusting of Damon at these incrementally closer levels of intimacy, at first I thought that the sex would have to progress in pretty much the same way. So I had Laurent coming into the room, but instead of just going for it, there was sort of a stop-start dynamic with Laurent really hesitating on every threshold, with Damon kind of doing the work to coax him into bed. Looking back, I think I wrote that draft out of some kind of anxiety or worry that I was skipping stages in the progression towards sex. So what I mean is I knew that considering the glacial pace of the unresolved sexual tension up until this chapter, there was some expectation embedded in the book that the sex would unfold just as slowly. You know, that classic arc where they just kissed for the first time a few chapters ago, so maybe in a few more chapters they might get around to second base, and so on until after a series of nights spent rolling around together doing everything on the bucket list, they'll finally get around to penetration, and then there'll be a happily ever after, and that's the end of the book. But of course, that's not in character for Laurent. Laurent is not a person whose barriers get gradually lowered. Laurent's all or nothing. And while it was easy for both Laurent and Damon to compartmentalize or pretend that sexuality was not part of what was going on between them, when what was going on between them was flirtation or sexuality by proxy or by substitution, once the kiss happened, that was unmistakably real, and it's not something that either of them could pretend about any longer. And Laurent doesn't prevaricate. Laurent doesn't do things by halves, no matter how difficult things are for him, especially if things are difficult for him. So from a characterization standpoint, that meant that he needed to just walk into that room, armored to the teeth, and have Damon on his back in 10 seconds flat. The whole time that I was trying to get that other, more hesitant version to work, I could feel how wrong it was. It killed the tension. The writing was dead on the page. It was excruciatingly out of character for Laurent. It also made him extremely, to use the Japanese term, uke-esque. And that's not his lifetime affiliation. But it was initially so counterintuitive to me to have Laurent physically pushing Damon down onto the bed with Damon as the no, wait, stop character, that it took me several false starts before I realized what I had to do. I should say that it was counterintuitive to have Laurent push Damon onto the bed because Laurent doesn't physically push people around ever. He pushes people around verbally all the time, sure, but he doesn't physically lay hands on them and shove them as he does here. One problem that I had was that anytime Laurent explained the reason for his actions, it just killed the tension in the scene. The fact is that the sex itself is the expression of Laurent's internal motivations. He's physically acting in a way that is expressing what's going on in his interior. So if he expressed himself in another way, such as by explaining his motivations verbally, it oddly rendered the sex and the physical actions pointless. It just kind of caused an emotional double up that killed any sense of drive or tension or forward momentum in the scene. So I couldn't articulate Laurent's motivations explicitly, but at the same time, I did have to somehow show the reader why Laurent is there. You know, Laurent's emotional arc is a fundamental part of the chapter. I ended up doing that by packing the dialogue just as densely as I could. When he says, I don't want to talk about Aymeric or my uncle, and when he says, you're leaving tomorrow. Those are the only things he says really about why he's here, about why he's doing this, and about why he's doing this now. That was really the maximum exposition that the scene could sustain without the tension falling out. It seemed that a lot of people did get it. They sort of naturally clicked in with the right reading. So I think in that sense, my approach worked out. I know that I did lose some readers. I got some feedback along the lines of the sex seemed to come out of nowhere. It didn't seem to make sense that Laurent would do this. I think having a really good understanding of Laurent is the key to unlocking this scene. You need to understand, what's just happened with Aymeric and Laurent's reaction to it, as well as what it means that Damon is leaving tomorrow. This was a 2-act sex scene. And in my head, I thought of it as Act 1, Laurent is in control. Act 2, Laurent surrenders control. It was really important to me that each character had their time in which their sexuality controlled the scene. I don't necessarily like these words, top and bottom, but both Damon and Laurent are very, very toppy in very, very different ways. Damon's section was much easier to work out. Damon's way of topping is sort of classic. It's very physical. He's physically on top and he's making sure that his partner has the time of their life. That's the ultimate expression of Damon as a top. The ultimate expression of Laurent as a top is for him to mindfuck you from across the room. No one has to take their clothes off or even touch one another for Laurent's sexuality to be fully engaged. We've seen Laurent topping Damon basically from the beginning of book 1 up until now. So that led to another false start. At first, instead of just pushing Damon down onto the bed, I had Laurent giving orders, saying things like get on the bed or take off your shirt, but it kept causing the scene to break down. It gave Damon too much space to understand that maybe something was wrong. The only reason Damon doesn't stop things in this scene the way that it's currently written is because things progress too fast for him to process what's going on. It actually took me a while to work that out, that a too fast progression was the only thing that was going to stop Damon's objections and keep the scene rolling. But the other reason that Laurent giving orders didn't work, and this was the main reason, and it took me ages to work out, was exactly because giving orders is within the usual spectrum of behavior for Laurent. Laurent's comfortable giving orders. He's comfortable with distance. He's comfortable with mind games. But this scene was about Laurent pushing himself to do something that was uncomfortable. There needed to be that element of self-coercion. He had to be pushing himself outside of his comfort zone. I was unreasonably proud of the line, "What am I doing? You are not very observant." I think because "what are you doing" is such a used line during sex scenes. That line comes up all the time. It's been answered every which way. And I was so excited that I managed to come up with a rejoinder that seemed fresh-ish. I just want to say I think it's hot that Damon calls him Your Highness in bed. I may or may not have a hardcore thing for princes. Sorry, not sorry. I see you are everywhere in proportion. I tried so hard to come up with a giant animal joke here and I just couldn't do it. I remember when I first started blocking this scene and working out who was going to do what, even when I first started thinking about the scene, that it was really important to me in this first half of the scene that Laurent was completely in control, that he was giving nothing of himself away, and yet at the same time, for him to be unconsciously constructing a form of sex in which he was, I'm almost not sure how to put this, but in which he was in a kind of a service role. I like the idea that in his mind, he was taking charge, but in objective reality, he was having a form of sex that was completely defined by his past experiences, that it was a kind of a learned model of sex. I remember doing a lot of thinking around what that act could be, and I ended up with a hand job because I liked the idea that it was impersonal. It was actually the most impersonal yet hands-on form of sex that I could think of, that allowed him to be physically on top of Damon, that allowed him to be emotionally in control, and yet it was servicing of Damon. I remember actually I wrote another version where it happened on the window seat rather than in the bed, and Damon was kind of, he was sitting on the seat with his fingers curled into the window grill, and Laurent had one knee on one side of his thigh and was in his lap. I was still sort of exploring what would be Laurent's learned behaviors in bed, and I thought that having him in someone's lap would be twisted in a way that was hot. But what it gained in hotness, it sort of lost in overplaying the idea, so I didn't end up using it. The other idea was to have Laurent just drop and give Damon head, but my headcanon, get it, since forever, is that Laurent doesn't go down, so I didn't do that. This line about the rise and fall of Laurent's hand being like his words, this came about because one difficulty that I have with writing Laurent that might not be obvious to the casual reader is that for some reason, if Laurent isn't talking, he tends to drop out of a scene so that it's as if he's not there at all. It happens fairly quickly too. It happens within 2 or 3 paragraphs, and even if those paragraphs are actively describing him. That problem was obviously really difficult to control in this chapter, where the action relies on these descriptive passages without Laurent talking, but yet they have to intimately involve Laurent. It has to feel as though Laurent is present in the scene without any dropout. I remember I was talking to my friend Anna Cowan about it on one of my writing days with her, and she said something like, well, can you make it so that his actions are like his talking? And that was the genesis of that line. Adequate. Oh my God. Adequate was literally the last line that I wrote in this entire chapter. This one word took me that entire 5 months of writing to come up with. I went through so many drafts and thinking before I got that line to come out. I can still remember where I was when I wrote it. I was sitting in this ugly wingback that I have in my room, and it was like 2 a.m. and I was writing with that kind of glazed late night feeling where the words are almost swimming in front of my face and I didn't think I was going to be able to get anywhere. And that line just finally just came out. And when it did, I can't describe my feelings. I was just like, oh, thank God. I talked earlier about how difficult transitions can be when you're trying to transition from one set of emotions to another or from one arc to another. Those transition moments can be some of the most technically challenging moments in a book. And this word, adequate, is the transition between Laurent's way of sex to Damon's way of sex. So I suppose in retrospect, it makes sense why I found it so difficult to find the pivot on which this scene could turn. But oh my God, it was tough. The kissing. I had that idea for so long that I can't even remember when I first came up with it. I suppose it's kind of a cliche that kissing is more intimate than sex, or can be more intimate than sex. I'm not sure if that's really true, but I think narratively it feels true. And I think for Laurent especially, there are some areas where he's extremely proficient and extremely experienced. And there are some areas where he's kind of virginal. He doesn't have a lot of experience. He doesn't really know what to do. I wanted the scene to really show that about him. But all of that threw up another problem, which is that intimacy and emotional vulnerability isn't easy or comfortable for Laurent. So the scene couldn't feel easy or comfortable, but Damon experiences the sex as this wondrous thing. So wondrous yet uneasy is this contradiction that was quite difficult to write around. If that gives any insight into the crazy problems that had to be resolved in this chapter, I was often trying to create and sustain these two contradictory states simultaneously. So wondrous yet uneasy, or cathartic but yet tense. One way that I tried to do that was to find an emotion that would allow me to express both those things. And in this case, the emotion that I used was reverence. I felt that an approach of reverence would show from Damon that he was finding things wondrous, but yet at the same time would allow me to show parts of the scene in which Laurent was tense or uncomfortable or uneasy and so on. No kidding. That line was controversial when I wrote it, and it still remains controversial to this day. I've had some readers tell me that it's their favorite line in the book, and I've had other readers tell me that it's anachronistic. This whole section of dialogue, all the way from I find it difficult to let go of control, all the way down through you're so tense, are you sure you've done this before? Contrary, aren't you? All of that. I wrote it really early. I wrote it when I was about halfway through writing book 1. So it was a really early vision for the scene, but there was one change, and that was this. When Damon says, "You're so tense, are you sure you've done this before?" I originally had that dialogue continue like this. Laurent said yes, Damon says this, and Laurent said yes. And then in the original version, I had this section where Damon said, "You didn't like it?" And Laurent said, "No, I liked it. And Damon said, "So wasn't it?" And then Laurent said, "Will you stop talking about it?" I think those extra 2 lines just ended up pushing things a little bit too far, so I ended up cutting them out. So let's talk about who's on top. Because I received so many emails about it, I thought that I would make a definitive statement. I personally do not think that what goes where in a sex scene has anything to do with who holds the power in the sex scene, which character is the dominant character in the sex scene, if there is one, or who is in the position of power in the sex scene. To me, there is nothing inherently dominant or powerful about putting one thing inside of another thing. If you construct that act as powerful, it's because you think that the object being inserted is somehow more powerful than the thing it's being inserted into. You've somehow come to imbue a penis with additional power and constructed it as more powerful than a vagina or a butt or a mouth. Think of it this way. You don't think that you're dominating a shark when you stick your arm in a shark's mouth. That's because you think of a shark as more powerful than an arm. So I made my choices in the scene based not on power or power dynamics, but actually on matters of characterization. I felt that if Laurent was facing fears, that he would face them head on. A wild phial of oil appears. I just didn't want to interrupt the scene by having them go and get the oil and come back. So there it was. I actually think it worked fine. You don't question it, I hope. To get what you want, you have to know exactly how much you're willing to give up. I knew that was going to be the line and the theme of the sex scene. I knew that pretty early on. I knew that from about halfway through writing book 1. Knowing so early allowed me to set that line up. I had Laurent say it to Damon at the midway point of book 2. I like the idea that it was something that Laurent said, that it was a way of looking at the world that was particularly Laurent's, but that it was something that Damon would return to in his mind at this moment. The difficult thing about the line was actually trying to find a place earlier in the book where I could get Laurent to say it. And I remember just coming up with so many different awkward conversations where that line just didn't quite work, but I managed to get it in there in the end. I purposely chose to try and imbue the latter half of this scene with a sadness. I thought that that was one of the only ways that I could sustain a larger tension in the romantic arc. If they came together and the sex was just kind of hot, that would have been satisfying in one way, but I think it would have released a lot of the tension. There would have been a lot of catharsis, and I don't think that it would have served the larger story quite as well. I had a line that I had Damon saying to Laurent in an earlier draft, and that was, "So I can have you without having you." When I first wrote it, Damon was saying it in response to the way that Laurent was giving his body, but sort of emotionally withholding. I decided that making it explicit was overstating the idea, and I tried instead to take that line and make it the theme or the feeling that underpinned the scene, the idea that you can have something without having it. I felt like was at the heart of their relationship at this point in the book. I wrote a character note for myself very early on in the process. Sometimes I do this. I write notes pen to paper, lines or feelings or thoughts that are important to the scene that I have to hold in my mind while I'm writing. And I just thought I'd read this one out. Damon would have been the perfect lover for a younger Laurent, that shy, hero-worshipping boy who trailed around after his older brother, but that Laurent no longer exists. And with that, we've come to the end of the DVD commentary. Thank you all so much for listening. I had a lot of fun doing this. I hope you had fun listening. I would love to do something like this again. So I'll say that I will see you all next time.